Welcome to Upside, where we dig into the real stories that live behind the headlines affecting European venture. This week, we've got an interloper in our midst. We've got Andreas from EUVC. I'm going to get you to do a little intro in a sec. I'll let everyone will know you. Mads Lomax and myself. And we're pretty much talking about digital sovereignty this week. Not just digital sovereignty. We are going to take a little look at Nvidia and why that's important. Some UK government and Apple getting feisty, and some trouble at mill with what's going on with regulation and the EU and the UK government, but mainly digital sovereignty and what sovereignty is, why it matters, and all the unpickings there. So we're going to start right at the top.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
First up, Mads, this is you. Before we go into some of the context, why is Nvidia so important?
It's the poster child of the AI economy. I think it's the one company that everybody pinned their hopes on. It's the bellwether, the canary in the coal mine. It's the thing that's telling us whether things are heading in the right direction or not. We all have a sense that AI is going to transform the world and how we live and what's happening around us. And so far, Nvidia has been the one that's more than anybody else been able to capitalize on that, because they're still the shovels and picks that everybody else is using. And so, everybody's looking closely at the numbers here to try and give us a sense of which direction are we going in. And then, of course, let's not forget, it is the largest and most valuable company in the world.
It's, what was it? I think it's 3% of global market cap or something.
It's something insane like that.
It's 5 to 6% of S&P 500. It's 20% of Nasdaq. I mean, it's extraordinary, no?
What I also didn't realize was, until reading behind the headlines, that for a $50 billion data center installation, Nvidia will take half. I mean, it's just a behemoth. And Jensen thinks that by the end of the decade, we'll see 3 to 4 trillion in AI infrastructure spending. So I guess that's why it's important.
I think this quarter, 100 billion of revenue, 25 billion of net income. I was looking at historic net income numbers. In 2018, their net income was 250 million. So in 7 years, it's gone from 250 in a quarter in Q2 to 25 billion. Even in 2023, it was only 600 million in Q2. So I mean, these numbers are absolutely extraordinary. And I think one of the key pieces of news here is that the markets didn't really move off the back of this, and that it's already priced in this growth. It's staggering.
We are in a bit of a deceleration phase, though, aren't we, with the growth numbers?
The company's already so big. They are the market in many ways. As you said, such a huge proportion of data center spend is funneled towards them. And we've been through that massive inflection on hyperscaler data center spend. It keeps growing, but it's just growing more slowly because now the base is so much bigger. You had a couple quarters ago, it was 17% growth quarter on quarter, and then 16%, then 10%, and then this quarter it was 5% when you look isolated at the data center business, so the AI business. So 5% quarter on quarter, it's just a lot less exciting than some of those massive growth rates we saw previously. And of course, that's changing things.
Analysts weren't jumping out of their chairs to shout about it was, 56%? Mads, what were the numbers? They did their earnings report on Thursday, I believe.
So it was 56% year over year, but only 5% quarter on quarter when you look at the data center business.
Right.
So it just says that growth is starting to plateau. I mean, they'll keep growing for at least a while yet, but we've certainly shifted kind of that extraordinary growth we saw previously.
Andreas, what would you add to this? I mean, do you still see Nvidia as being, the poster child, the bellwether?
Well, of course, it is on a global scale. What I'm sitting here thinking was, while the three of you talked here, was who are our European counterparts to an Nvidia? We have ASML, we have ST Microelectronics, we have Infineon Technologies. You can argue we have ARM as well. I don't know where you would place that entirely, which actually, if you look at the market cap of those companies, we're getting to something like 700 billion, which is actually a lot. And this takes me back to something that I think a lot about in the European context is, why is it that we always talk about what's happening in the US ecosystem, and how do we get out of that US orientation in both our media, your talks here, my talks on my podcast, Sifted, TechEU, Financial Times, it continues down down to everyone. And that's kind of my thinking here. But to your question, Dan, I 100% believe that yes, of course, Nvidia is where you can always see where the market is moving. And then, of course, this very much shows how that geopolitics now completely can change the game for actors, private market actors like Nvidia or anyone else in the current market, which, of course, I think gives us a very important learning in the European ecosystem, which is we got to cut our dependence somehow from the US and everything else that's going on. Not saying that we got to just focus on Europe, but we have to find a path where we can do this ourselves.
I mean, we're going to talk a lot about digital sovereignty, unpack it, what it means, who's buying what from whom, and how that's going to play forwards. First up, I wanted to just touch on Apple's contentious conversations with UK government. It seems to be a Europe-UK regulation challenge with big tech, and this week Apple and the UK government are still kind of tussling over regulation. Apple warning about overreach, stating if not careful, we could damage user privacy and security, stifle innovation, and compel the company to share its proprietary technology with foreign competitors for free, which sounds like a lovely threat. Now, the CMA insists that greater competition can be achieved without sacrificing any of that. But the fact is that we're in a duopoly. We've got Google and Apple fighting out for our mobile world. I kind of personally think that it's fair to think beyond capitalism and money and work out what kind of market, society, economies we want to create. So I kind of welcome the discussion. But what's going on here? What's the tussle about, Mads? Can you kick this one off?
Well, I guess you could say at a headline, another week, another sort of UK regulatory threat to Apple. So, Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, they want some strategic market status, some rules around payment alternatives and interoperability. And, I think we'll discuss all the issues with the stance. But if we sort of just steelman the argument for a minute. So Apple takes 30% of the, app economy, right? Everything on the Apple ecosystem is the Apple tax. And you could argue that smaller developers, they get genuinely disadvantaged. You could argue that if there is an alternative to this duopoly you talk about, then that could save consumers millions, and that would benefit, consumers would benefit citizens. You could also argue that interoperability between wallets and watches could bring a lot of benefit, could open up the possibility to create new apps in the ecosystem. And then there's sort of the whole idea of the UK finding its post-Brexit regulatory path, right? Not sort of Brussels, but also not Washington, sort of Singapore and Thames, striking out our own. You're trying to create, as you say, the world as we think it should be, not just accepting what is.
Going broader and looking at where regulation has worked, not worked, where any kind of intervention like this has made the world a better place for us. What have you seen?
So one thing I will just touch on before that is the Singapore and Thames dream, I think, of many is dead. And actually chatting to a family office the other day, in the family office circles in London, they're now calling it Soviet Union on Thames is the new moniker being around. So, look, I think just when it comes to competition, Dan, and just picking up, I don't think there's an inconsistency, but there's clearly not an inconsistency between wanting to curtail the power of big companies and a thriving capitalist, economy, ecosystem, right? In fact, any functioning capitalist system needs the ability to break and stop and curtail the power of monopolies, right? Otherwise, fundamentally, capitalism, competition, free markets, etc., doesn't work. I think there's a big picture here is that the network effects of technology companies and the speed at which they've grown have just caught traditional ways of the competition watchdogs on the back foot. In the past, you'd be worried about, I don't know, a steel mill, generating 100 years ago, generating too much of a monopolistic position, and there'd be a way of doing something about it. If you look at what's happened with Google in the past 20 years, and now is happening with the AI companies, the competition watchdogs have been completely caught flat-footed and have been playing catch-up. And one thing I was wondering, why the UK isn't, this isn't a new issue, Apple and Google. This Apple issue is not, this hasn't been suddenly it's a new thing that the UK is flexing its muscles on. This has been the position for the last 10, 15 years. So look, I think there is generally I think we as a society need to think about, if we want to benefit from technology and see them funded and see the technology kind of get to the level of maturity and cost for us to actually derive productivity benefits from it, we need companies to grow, et cetera, and the technology to develop. But at the same time, society needs this kind of break with the competition watchdogs actually calling out the monopolistic practices of these companies. So I'm not averse to this, and I don't think that doesn't sound like you are too, Dan. When it comes to this sort of regulation being good, I mean, we often bemoan European regulation and on technology, and Europeans are better at regulating than building. There are some examples where what the UK CMA is planning on doing now actually works, and I would point to open banking. I don't think the banks were that keen on that, right? And you've seen them forced open to open some of their stack, and we've seen tremendous technology built off the opportunities of businesses, Monzo, Revolut, et cetera, built off the back of that. So there are good things that can come of it. Apple clearly will scream all sorts of bad things that will come from it because they are the monopolist or duopolist here. But anyway, that's it's not all bad.
Mads, what's the reality here with the actual fight?
Yeah, I'll just take the other side for a minute, because the thing is, the CMA in the UK is actually staffed by some pretty smart people. Like, I met them, I respect them. I wonder whether they're in the right organization. It feels like we often, and that's not just a competition watchdog in the UK, but more generally, we spend a lot of time fighting the last war. I mean, let's look at some of the reality here. The UK is less than 1% of Apple's revenue. We could zero leverage. We failed on encryption, where the UK government tried to force Apple to open up the encryption algorithm. And then Apple basically said, well, listen, we're just not going to offer the deep encryption to UK consumers. What a terrible outcome for us. The US has now reportedly made the UK back down, at least those are the latest reports, which is both embarrassing and just shows that all that wasted effort on trying to force somebody to do something, when actually there's so many other things we should be focusing on. Sort of say, maybe the thing that's happening right now is we're getting the worst of both worlds, right? It's not kind of light touch Singapore, but it's also not sort of some of the market power that comes out of Brussels, because we're just so small on our own. And so to me, the big question is, should we be fighting what feels like a 2010 battle around mobile platforms in 2025 when everything is about AI? And I'd argue maybe we should have some of the smart people in the CMA, more focused about thinking about, how can the UK become an AI superpower? Because actually, I think that's the only thing that matters now. And to some extent, some of this other stuff is just theater.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Andreas, what's the path forwards? What would you do if you were in the CMA or in the European body? How would you tackle this?
Well, first and foremost, I would say that I think Apple and Trump and Mark Andreessen and every other U.S. commentator that mock our regulatory morass, they're not wrong when they laugh at us. I think GDPR has held startups back, and honestly, I think it poses a major risk to any real AI innovation, as it blocks access to a lot of important data. And you've also seen in the Atomico State of European Tech report that the CMA has increased startup compliance cost by 25%. So we have some real stuff to solve internally. That said, when I look at what's happening now between Apple and Trump and everything here, I think it's really a matter of a rebalancing of power between the US giants and, of course, us here in Europe. I think UK and EU, I think we need to think of this as the same thing, and I really hope that the two administrations do so. So I really think this is the US playing hardball with their lobbying and their tariffs and their saber rattling, and I think that we should too. And I honestly think that this is a moment for us all to recognize that the European VC ecosystem is growing up. We've got 60 billion raised in 2025. We've grown our ecosystem 10x over the last 10 years. So we're on a great path. But I really think that now is the time for VCs to do the same thing as you three are doing here, which is start talking, getting into the debates, taking a stance. We have incredible goodwill in society. We have more than 70% of Europeans are favorably inclined to tech founders, which I think that should really be our rallying cry, to go public with our stances and call out when there's problems in the CMA, as an example, or with the GDPR, because it's stifling innovation. I think we really need to do it, and I think we have the ability to do it because we have the public behind us. And I think we're making a huge mistake by not leveraging our incredible founders like Daniel Dines from UiPath or Mistral's Arthur Mange, because they can really sway policymakers. We've seen it in the States. I think we got to learn from that playbook. And I think it's time that we, as VCs, revisit our alliances, stop taking the side of private equity and take the side of tech founders instead, because that is where we get backing from society. We don't do that by allying with the people in our European Wall Streets. That's not where we will get power. We'll get it by being with our founders.
Very aligned with our upside mantra. Go, battle, rally cry. Let's go for it.
100%.
Before we move on, because we are very naturally leaning into the sovereignty piece. We're talking about, ownership, sovereignty, government intervention, more control, and regulators. But anything else on the Apple piece before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, amen to what Andreas is saying, but I think there's a point that I was getting at, which is that, yes, we want technology to be pervasive, to be cheap, to be beneficial. But I'm afraid if you want a functioning capitalist society, you need to have a check on monopolies, right? And I feel like going after Apple probably, as Mads said, is going after the horse has already bolted. I would use the lessons from Web 1.0, 2.0 to inform what we do about AI. Because AI, there will be a potentially, with the network effects involved, could potentially be winner takes all. And so what do the UK and Europe do about monopolistic positions taken by AI companies going forwards? I think that's an interesting theme. I think the Europeans, the CMA and their equivalents in the EU need to think about that, and they probably need to rip up what they did before and do something going forwards that's much more collaborative with the US. Yeah, like the EU is a massive market for these companies. The EU has some power. But it doesn't need to be done through black letter law issued out of Brussels. It needs to be done in a much more collaborative way with our counterparts over the Atlantic and with business, right? Look, the problem is us, Peter Thiel, you read the Founders Fund manifesto. What do we want to back? We want to back monopolistic businesses. Yeah, that's what we do. That will make huge amounts of money for our LPs, and hopefully we'll have more pension funds invested in us, and et cetera, et cetera. So we do our job, that's fine. You show us the incentive, you see where the outcome and result comes. But they need to think about this in a much more broader, holistic way. And I think there needs to be a smarter way to think about this. And we can learn the lessons from the past and try and apply them to the future, right? I think going after Apple is the wrong bone to be chewing on at the moment. I think we should be thinking very seriously about what we do. Otherwise, we've all seen Ready Player One, right? The one industry that controls the world. That is a serious thing. And yes, I'm a maximalist when it comes to technology, but I'm afraid that there does need to be some otherwise, broader society. I don't know, if I spent my summer holidays chatting to a lot of people who don't work in tech, very suspicious of AI. Most people on the street, yeah. But chatting to someone in government the other day, the UK government, every time that AI is mentioned, that's a net loss for the government. They don't want people to be talking about AI because most people are scared about it. So I think we need to think about, and that could become a major inhibitor on the adoption of AI more broadly, right? So anyway, that's sort of more macro.
Well, we are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the UK government buying AI because there's some stories to discuss there.
Do you want to retort to the retort?
Go.
I love this discussion. Yeah.
Well,
no, I mean, so listen, I don't fundamentally disagree with you. Okay, we need some rules, but here's the thing: it wasn't the Department of Justice that brought IBM to its knees. It was Microsoft. It wasn't the Department of Justice that brought Microsoft to its knees. It was Google and Apple. Creative destruction is the most powerful thing in capitalism. If we want to set the agenda globally, we have to compete. We can't regulate our way to greatness. This idea that we can sit in Westminster or in Brussels and just make the rules and then the world will be great, it's total nonsense. We've got to create the conditions for innovation and for great companies.
I fully agree with you. I was advocating for a more collaborative state with Washington first, but I think you're right. And the private
I think
sector.
the problem fundamentally, we're completely aligned. I think the problem fundamentally is so many of the people that are tasked with both the legislation and the regulation are fundamentally quite far from what actually happens in the startup ecosystem in terms of how to build companies, how to grow them. And so they are a little bit afraid to engage at the quote unquote grassroots level in the detail to figure out, as you say, collaboratively talk meat. And so you end up sitting at a distance, writing these slightly technocratic rules that end up breaking all kinds of things instead of actually making things go faster. Now, Dan, I don't want to take any more of your thunder. I know we're going to come back to kind of regulation and sovereignty and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But there is so much to unpack here.
Yeah, well, we are. I mean, the next three topics are leaning very heavily into sovereignty and looking at the US, looking at China, looking at UK and Europe. But I also, to your point, Lomax, I also wonder how you negotiate or work collaboratively with the Trump administration when he is basically threatening via Truth Social at 2 a.m. whatever topic he wants to threaten about. So I don't know the reality of working more collaboratively when everything seems to be a heavy leaded foot. But anyway, let's get into sovereignty. The next three topics are very much talking about governments, public-private markets, regulation, what is data sovereignty, how and what and where and why we should do. So the US government has this is what kind of triggered it for me. So the US government has just bought 10% of Intel. Now, I didn't realize the full deal until I looked behind the headlines. They haven't just bought 10% of the stock. What they've done is this equity comes by converting previously awarded but unpaid grants. So these come from the US Chips and Science Act and other initiatives. And they also have, I thought quite interesting, they also have a 5% warranty if Intel's foundry business, think like TSMC, their production arm, if that drops below 51% ownership. So to kick off, I mean, Mads, maybe you can start this. I mean, broadly, forgetting Intel for now, but broadly, should governments be involved in tech? Should they buy?
It's so hard to disentangle the question from the specifics here. I mean, this is a unique situation where the US government had already promised Intel money, and now a bit belatedly is waking up and saying, well, gosh, if we're giving you $10 billion, maybe the taxpayer should get something in return other than sort of a feel-good factor of we help potentially to save a company. So I actually think the idea here of making sure the taxpayer gets some upside from the money, I think is absolutely right. I think the challenge of doing it retroactively is challenging, right? The deal certainty is gone. You'd like to think as if whether you're a private citizen or whether you're an entrepreneur or a business, if you make a deal with the government, that deal stands. And the challenge with Trump is he'll wake up the next day and he'll get a new idea and then he'll sort of, quote unquote, rip up, what people thought were an agreement and then change the rules. I don't think that's a good way to run a country. I don't think that's a good way to do business. Moreover, if we recall the backdrop leading up to this, he basically he was gunning for the head of the CEO of Intel.
Yeah, it was only 2 weeks ago, right?
Absolutely. So it's a classic Trump shakedown where you sort of you put a gun to the guy's head and you say, listen, you're not really an American, and and Intel has had huge problems, but it's just that kind of the optics here of Trump putting that level of pressure on the CEO of Intel, then to go back and rip up a past agreement and say, oh, that $10 billion we promised you, well, actually now we want the equity in return. It's not a great way to run a country. It feels a little bit more like sort of the shadier world of the shadier part of the world, if you will.
It's classic Trump, isn't it? It's like quid pro quo, art of the deal. What am I getting in return for my 10 billion? I want some equity. I think.
Yeah, the thing is, the deal's been struck. You'd like to think that new administrations, they honor, the agreements that have been done in the past. I mean, we've just had the same now with Ørsted, the large Danish, wind power.
Sorry, do I
wind
cross
power
myself
company
at this point? Sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Trump, he wants Greenland. The Danes have said no, and then he starts to cancel contracts and sort of rip up agreements that have been made with Danish companies.
Yeah.
It's an odd way
But
to
we
do
know,
business.
guys, come on. We know, as in we know this now. The only thing predicted about Trump is his unpredictability. He doesn't care about what was agreed before. He will do whatever he thinks, depending on what side of bed he gets out that morning. So I do think that, I completely agree with you, Mads. This is a change in the way governments have done business for years, and it's also a change from a pre-existing deal. I do, in terms of seeing a wider trend here, yeah, it's consistent with industries of critical national significance taking on an even more prominent role than they have in the past, and the current kind of retrenchment from globalization. However, this is just Trump being Trump, isn't it?
But this is. I mean, governments have always stepped in when companies have struggled, like you're talking about nationally dependent companies. But obviously, Intel isn't that. But they are a bit of a sitting duck, Lomax. So give us some of the context as to kind of how you feel about
that's
Intel
exactly the
specifically.
point, Dan. Is the benevolent hand of the state has stepped in times of trouble, in choppy waters. We saw it with the bank bailouts. You've seen it with the airplane manufacturers over the years. We've seen it with the GM, Chrysler, and we've seen it with AIG in the US, where I think the government took an 80 to 90% stake at one point. So normally, and we've seen it in Europe and the UK, it's when in times of crisis, the government steps in to steady the ship. This is slightly different here. I mean, Intel's problems, we know, are well publicized, but this is not a company that's about to go bankrupt. This is a government coming in a critical industry and a big listed US company. So it's a departure from what's happened in the past. I think, as I said, it's consistent with what's going on now. Governments are now much more interested in critical industries. So I think there may be similar kind of things that happen in minerals, for example, in clearly continuing in semiconductors and chips.
I'll tell you what it is, Lomax. I mean, I think building a market-leading semiconductor and foundry business takes decades, and once it's gone, it's gone. You can't. It's not like a steel mill where you could probably go back up and boot it up again and get some people in and maybe put in a little bit of new technology and maybe a year or two and you have it back. If Intel dies, that's it. And you're saying it's not about to die. And I think you're right. I mean, Microsoft systems are probably going to be running on Intel for the foreseeable future, but you risk losing so much technological edge that it will be impossible to catch up. And at that point, you may have an issue. So I think there is an argument that it is a strategic asset. I think the CHIPS Act was probably done incorrectly in the sense just doling out the money instead of actually taking equity in return. I think it's the retroactive changing of the deal that's the real problem here.
Governments propping up national champions has happened for decades. It's been as old as corporations are. You've had this going on. I mean, look in Europe, for example. How do governments do this? They become contractors, customers, which is what we talked about here before. They become big customers. They issue subsidies, or reduce taxes or cash, etc., or they invest, or a combination of all three. And we've seen that over decades, right? And you see it now with Ørsted, right? You just talked about them, Mads. The big rights issue they're about to do. The Danish government, I think, is going to underwrite that rights issue, or certainly be a big contributor to it. So that's an investment for equity. Look at Airbus, which has basically been propped up by a combination of national contracts from national aircraft, national flag carriers over the years, and probably from subsidies and probably from investment from all the European governments, right? Look at it with Eutelsat now in satellites in Europe, which is looking to try and take on Starlink with OneWeb, etc. That's all very government backed. So ultimately, this is nothing new. It's just in the US, it's a slightly new way of doing things, I'd say.
Well, this comes back to my original question: is should governments buy? And I guess the real question is, should they buy outside of downturns or problematic times, or when companies are in trouble? Could this be part of a strategy rather than giving grant subsidies and what should governments take equity? That was the initial question. Any other thoughts on that before I ask Andreas for the upside?
But I'd say absolutely not, except in special circumstances. I do think there's a big argument to be made for sovereign wealth funds. I think, but that's done in a completely different way, right? That's government acting as an investor that invests in assets that can generate a return, as opposed to, as Lomax says, picking champions. Because picking champions generally is a terrible idea. And then there are exceptions to that. There are strategic areas. There are things where government has to be involved because they're so critical for us. It's like things like energy. Like nothing works without power. We've totally failed in Europe with our energy policy. That's one of the reasons why our manufacturing is struggling so much. And I'd argue that semiconductors is another area like that. It's the physical layer of the digital economy. And if you don't have some semiconductor autonomy, that can put your whole economy at risk. We saw that during the COVID times when the semiconductor supply chain suddenly froze, and that completely stopped the European automotive industry. So we have to have access to semiconductors. There's also the inputs to these sectors, the rare earths, the critical minerals, the input for everything. If we allow others to have chokeholds on those sectors, they can freeze our economy. And then you have things like food security, and you have things like the inputs to pharmaceuticals, the health, which is really important. And then finally, space and satellite. You know, as Andrew, he likes to say, right, the one who controls space controls the earth. It's the access to everything. So I think there's sort of, 5 or 6 critical sectors where you can't just say, laissez-faire, it's fine. You've got to be a little less naive about things. But what you should certainly try and avoid picking winners. It's much more about creating the conditions for all the competition that can help bring European companies to be the very best they can be. So they can be global champions, not because they get propped up by the government, but because they have the best products in the world.
Andreas, you've already teed yourself up in my head as the voice of optimism and our champion of upside. So what would you do? I'm gonna lean on you for the positive outro to this piece.
I look at it with a bit of a different angle, and I'm a bit thrown off by the whole conversation around what's the role of the governments in this whole type of situation, and how should they act? Because Matthew said, while it's a completely different system when we're talking about how the sovereign wealth funds operate, and in Europe the EIT and EIF and EIB and these whole systems, and I'm curious if it is that much of a difference. Like, this is a different instrument that they go in and use, but in the end, they act very much like an investor, and then they use a bit their clout over Intel because of their situation and what they're ready to lean in to doing. But I wonder if, in the end, haven't we seen too often our states, especially up against the big industrial complexes, be too lenient, too kind on industry? If we look at the bailout of the banks after the financial crisis, we didn't get enough out of that, right? We saved the whole sector, and now it's kind of running beautifully again, and they're pumping more money out into the system, making more money for themselves than they ever have. And we didn't really, as society, get much out of that. It was just a one big handout to Wall Street. And I think I kind of come down on this side where, as long as you protect the integrity of the system, I actually think that it is good if our society, if our states start to go in and say, we want more.
No, sorry. I mean, just on that, that's just not factually correct, right? I mean, if you're talking about Wall Street, the TOP program was profitable for the US government.
But we could have gotten considerably more, right?
No, but that's not the point. The point you're saying is it was just a handout. If you make profit on something, it's not a handout. And I make a huge distinction there. The original CHIPS Act was a handout. That was just a handout. TOP wasn't a handout. And the argument I'm making is, I don't think we should be making handouts. I think as you're saying, absolutely, the taxpayer should reap some benefit, some upside when money is handed out.
My question is then, how brutally do you do that? And I don't know whether the approach of the Trump administration here has been too heavy-handed, or if it has not. I really do not know.
But that's easy, because you make an agreement with somebody and you rip it up later unilaterally and you breach the terms of that agreement. Of course, that's too heavy-handed. If we as citizens can't trust the government as a counterpart, what does that do to the rule of law? What does that do to our ability to plan? We know as businesses, one of the most important things is the ability to plan. Now, governments will make good deals and bad deals. Hopefully, they can make more good deals. And one of the challenges I have is that some of the same people that say Singapore and Thames and want the UK to become as sophisticated are also the first ones to scream that civil servants are paid too much. Well, guess where they're paid more than anywhere else, right? That's in Singapore. Because if you want smart people doing good deals, surprise, you have to attract the best and the brightest, but you have to compensate them.
The only thing I would add in terms of thinking about this for Europe, right? I mean, we talked about, this effectively state aid, whatever form it comes in, it happens, every day across a number of industries. is actually the US has more freedom to operate in this regard than Europe, right? Because of the very complicated state aid rules that we have in the EU. The moment one country starts, investing in a local champion, etc., the other countries call foul. So actually, will we be seeing a bunch more deals like the Intel deal in Europe? Maybe. I mean, but actually, it's a much harder environment to do it in than the US, for example, which isn't really subject to these rules because it doesn't have this big supranational organization sitting above it.
I always think it's funny that the anything state aid feels grey and subtractive and negative, and yet the whole of the US government is basically subsidized. Sorry, the US markets are subsidized by the US government via various mechanics, but that's probably a podcast for itself. So let's talk about the UK buying AI. We are in an interesting time in H1 2025. The UK government contracts for AI-related projects have reached 573 million this year, surpassing the whole total of last year. And now looking at who is on the vendor list, of the top 16 vendors selling into government in the last 5 years, 10 are from the UK or from Europe. However, the top two, Microsoft and Palantir, have already commanded over half of the awarded contracts. Value at 1.4 billion. I think the total is 2.4 billion. So those two companies alone are taking 1.4 billion. And none of these figures include the new OpenAI deal, which was announced a few weeks ago, working with the UK government. So again, we're sticking with sovereignty. And Mads, again, I'm going to lean on you first for this. What is this good, bad? How would you start this conversation?
Well, of course, the UK government has to buy technology. I think we've talked about that before. It's so important that we invest, that we bring in some of the best tools. I think about 20% of the spend over the last 5 years has gone to UK firms, the rest to predominantly US firms, with Microsoft and Palantir being the big suppliers. And that's true across all of Europe, by the way. So will it work? Yes, I think for efficiency, it will work. It will certainly not give us more autonomy. To do that, we have to develop more homegrown capability.
Lomax, where would you take this one on?
Okay, so two things I think here. Firstly, we've talked about this before here. It's great that the UK government is adopting AI, and this is evidence of it, right? And spending real money for the reason that, with an aging population, with government spending at record highs and the need to trim some of the fat and keep the tax burden low, which only keeps going up and up. And we talked about Soviet Union on Thames now. This is really, really great to see. So it's good to see the numbers dropping down. The second point, which is a broader conceptual point, is actually if the UK is not going to compete at the foundational model level, if it's not going to compete at the chips level, if it's not even going to potentially going to compete at the application layer level, right, with a big global AI tech leader, if it's not, you know what? The best thing the UK can do is become an early adopter and a big buyer of this and shape and form the development of these products. Now, I'm sorry, this is not original thinking. I was actually listening to Matt Clifford talking last weekend, and he's a big advocate of this. So this is not my own, me plagiarizing other people's work. I'm happy to attribute it. But it's a really powerful point, which is that if we're not going to do any of the three things that I just mentioned, which there's a high chance that we won't because we don't have the investment, we have the constraints we've talked about before. What we can do is become a big earlier adopter of this. We shape and form the development of these products. We get to know the people building them. That will deliver a lot of soft power to the UK economy, and the same could be said for Europe. And maybe you're calling me unambitious, but I'm also being realistic here, yeah? And we can sit here and talk. I think you've missed the boat. We talked about network effects earlier on many of these technologies, right? So why not become a power user effectively and become a key stakeholder that way, rather than trying to build these things ourselves, which we don't have a potentially great history of doing so, and a significantly lack of capital. So for those two reasons, I think it's great to see this, and call me unambitious, but I'm trying to take the upside out of something that could be very beneficial for us.
So Mads, First off, do you have any retort for Lomax?
Slightly unambitious, perhaps, Lomax. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think, listen, yes, we have to adopt technology. We've talked about it before. I think the best thing to do would be very aggressive around adoption. Lomax, you've talked about some of the issues you have with pushback in society, but the challenge we have is, as a country, we are heading towards being broke, right? I mean, you're looking at a welfare state that's going to cost, £3,000 per citizen per year, just in terms of transfer payments. I mean, it's unpayable. If we don't start to change things. And so you absolutely would invest very aggressively in automation. I would let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think that's important. We know these massive government procurement projects often end up going wrong. Doing more experimentation. Of course, we need to bring in the US players for, maybe it's right today to have them for the 50, 60, 70% of the workloads, but why not do a lot of experimentation on the side with European players, get some new technologies in. Mistral is still in the game. Why could they not be suppliers for some contracts so we could develop some more homegrown capability here in Europe? I think there's no reason not to. We don't have to go, okay, fine, the US are the best. We'll just buy 100% their stuff and not develop anything ourselves.
I would say to row back a little bit, or at least to sprinkle a little bit of optimism into maybe my lack of ambition, is the application field is wide open, right? So that's fine. And we have the talent, the capital, certainly like the entrepreneurs to build, big companies. And actually that's where being a power user comes in, because actually if we are going to adopt those companies at the application layer too, like that gives a great initial customer for these like local companies and local champions. So
I would say exactly right.
The other thing is actually application layer companies aren't all going to be founded by engineers. They're going to be, maybe a commercial co-founder too, for example. And actually the more adoption you have, I'm not suggesting a lot of them are going to be government employees, right? But the point is the more adoption you have across, public and private sector, you have the more people working with these tools, the more entrepreneurs who see the benefits of them, and more entrepreneurs who might be encouraged to set up their own company and team up with an engineer to do so. So I think all of this stuff is great. So there's nothing to complain about here. We can go back to the old complaints of not enough money, et cetera, too much red tape, not enough compute. We still need to be investing in compute. We still need to be investing in data centers. We still need to be investing in talent, cultivating all of that stuff. I'm just trying to take a very optimistic lens on what's happening here, because what the counterfactual here is that the UK government isn't spending any money on this damn stuff at all. And then we'd be even more morose about it.
I'd love to ask the three of you a question here, because government adoption or public institution adoption of AI tools, I think, is absolutely critical. It will really make a big difference. But then I look at things like GDPR, which is completely making it, at least the over-implementation of GDPR in Denmark has made it so that everyone I talk to are even afraid of knowing the name of the person they talk to almost, much less write it in any system that they don't know how it's being treated by whatever model is then sifting through that data. So I'm curious to ask you, because you're all investors investing every day in companies that are considering at least whether they should sell into government. Do you see startup founders thinking of this as too much of a roadblock for it to be possible? Or are you seeing a lot of ambitious companies focusing on government and governmental institutions as the adopters?
I think it's a great question. I mean, the track record of selling into government is just really, really complicated. And, Microsoft and Palantir can do it because they've got massive teams that know how to master the procurement cycles and navigate these difficult procurement processes. But for a startup, kind of a seed stage company, it's almost impossible. And so I think for so many venture capital investors, it's just been a bit of you're just going to steer well clear of that. And this is the point we've made so many times. Why don't we allocate a lot of the grant money that today is just, as we say, being doled out to procurement contracts and make it easier, kind of efficient procurement processes for smaller experiments to optimize and make more efficient different parts of the public sector, and specifically targeted at novel leading edge solutions from young companies. That's what we need, right? Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let lots of people have a go at creating a solution And we'd fund that if we know that the procurement process on the other side is really efficient and not a kind of 24 months marathon.
Early adoption sandboxes in limited use case scenarios are fantastic. So I think the more of those, the better. But to answer your question, Andreas, I mean, unless it's essential, for example, in defense, where governments basically are the buyers, clearly for a startup on startup timelines, raising money every 18 months, it's quite hard to advocate a B2G strategy. No,
I think there are two kind of conflating main key forces. One is a willingness now with the changing of the new world order to try new things, and AI has opened people's eyes, and technology is much more at the front of people's brains generally, and that's government and all of them. I mean, government is a massive multifaceted organization, and I also think that I don't know what generations we're on now, X, Z, A, whatever's coming through into the workforce are also much more tech savvy. So I think there are these two kind of key conflating forces which may unlock the ability for more startup friendly government, quasi-government interactions. I don't know. I maybe that's just wishful thinking, but it does feel like those two forces.
Maybe, if you look at the UI, the UX of these like laggard government, these systems, right? Like Epic and Cerner selling into, US hospitals, and you look at, that's basically aimed and set up for, non-tech literate government employees, right? Now, as people who work in the state are technology literate, I think there will be a shift. Those systems, I often say to our startups selling into healthcare, which is often government backed, it takes a generation to get in, and once you're in for 3 generations. We're going to come to the end of, like, as Andrew would say, like laggard, like legacy systems, right? And I think, as you're right, Dan, as more employees are more literate with using these tools, that will open the way for more dynamic, more forward-thinking systems or applications and products to be sold in, right? I'm sure.
Yeah,
to be optimistic on that.
I think so. I don't know if that answers your question, Andreas, but I think my sense is that there is an energy of change, and we will see how long that change takes to come through. But I'm hopeful, and I do think that the government spending as much in H1 as they did in the entirety of last year, although we don't know the timelines of some of those contracts, to be fair, I think that's a really positive sign. So I think we need to experiment. We need to do more. We need more AI in key services. So I think they're positive.
How many, I don't know, guys, across your portfolio and companies you meet, except for defense, like how many seed stage companies do you know or meet, like selling in or trying to sell into government? I mean, it's
very few.
Less than 1%.
But I think that there's a slight blur insofar as, from what I can understand, there are many government employees who are using AI tools without upward approval. So I don't know how deep and broad that goes within whatever organization, whether it's the DWP or in MOD or in HMRC, but you do hear and see stories of employees applying tools to manage their workflow, and there's obviously kind of a gray uptake of these AI toolkits. So I think it's a great thing. I think it's a great thing that the government's buying more and doing more, and I hope more startups are given more opportunity to get engaged. So I want to stay with digital sovereignty. I was reading 2 things this week. One was the Mario Draghi, who released his report on the failure of European competitiveness and some very clear directives as to what he thought Europe should do. And he's basically come back this week and said it's all too late, which I thought was quite depressing. However, that as the backdrop, also reading the boss of SAP on Europe's botched approach to digital sovereignty. So a couple of quotes from him. It'll be the application of AI that creates demand for massive computing power. Yep, we understand that. Public investment should flow directly into applied AI and software to create tangible competitive advantages, which I think we will all agree with. And coming to our previous points, we're now at this application layer where this very smart AI tech tool pack is going to lean into all of the core manufacturing, product, services, supply, everything that we need in our economies. So I don't know where to take this specifically, but I had two key questions. One is, do we think, if anyone's heard Mario Draghi's recent commentary, do we think it is all too late? Have we missed the boat? And I also want to kind of ask what we can learn from other countries, especially China and the US, around this digital sovereignty piece. So, Mads, I don't know, where would you like to start with this one?
But I think you asked the question about sovereignty and what is sovereignty. And it's really this ability to act autonomously without being subject to coercion or diktat by the outside. Kind of the fundamental question is, can you act without somebody else's permission? And Europe's pickle is we've outsourced production and manufacturing to China, and we've outsourced our defense to the US, and now we're also outsourcing our AI. And the challenge is that really erodes our sovereignty because it means we can no longer act without those geographies' permission. We saw in years gone by, whenever we had issues with China, they would, threaten sort of countermeasures, and we'd quickly back down. We've seen with the U.S. that Trump basically threatened to revoke the defense umbrella, and we sort of quickly succumbed and said, okay, yeah, sure, we'll you can slap tariffs on us, it's okay, and we'll remove ours, completely rebalancing global trade. So it just shows the price you pay for not having the sovereignty and being subject to others. And I think another question you asked is, what about other countries? What can we learn from them? I think China has really shown what works in some of these respects. Kind of you define sectors, you unleash a lot of competition, and then you let winners emerge. So people sometimes think that China is all about kind of the government picking winners. If you look at the EV industry, so BYD, that's now emerging as an absolute champion, was the result of fierce competition. So there were 500 Chinese EV companies all competing in a very Darwinian style, and only about 15 of those are likely to survive. So I think it's creating, as we've talked about earlier, this condition for a very competitive environment where you let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then you see who rise to the top, and you harness the best of free markets and capitalism, I think is what can get us back on the front foot. And it's eminently possible. I think we just have to think differently about how do we regulate, and how do we police, and where do we invest, and stop being so laid back about some of the stuff.
Interesting that China. I think most people wouldn't think that the Chinese government would behave like that. So I think that's a really interesting point. Lomax, what is sovereignty?
Well, I think Mads gave a very elegant definition that I don't really want to tamper with. It's the ability to be in control effectively, right? And as Mads said, and I would add, in terms of what Europe has outsourced in terms of defense production to China, we'd also outsourced a lot of energy to Russia, right? Particularly in Germany. So we'd actually lost sovereignty over energy as well. So I think Europe has this was in a way this was globalization. In a way everyone was supposed to be bought into this. The Americans too. Like this was the peace dividend. This was no more wars again. We were all supposed to be living
trade, not war.
Yeah, exactly. And now that sort of big experiment is effectively over, I would say, and potentially over, at least certainly for our lifetime. And so we're now growing back from that. The problem with, energy sovereignty, you can look at it, right, well, we'll just build some nuclear, for example, or build whatever, whether you want to build windmills, solar, etc. That's an easier thing to grapple with. I think digital sovereignty, even defense potentially. I mean, you build your own weapons. I mean, there'll still be some global supply chains to a certain extent, but technology, as we all know, is a much harder thing to have sovereignty over, because by definition is much more nuanced than those industries, right? So, talking about sovereignty over compute, over chips, over, talked about it earlier in the context of the UK government, over models. This is, what do we mean? Do we build all of this? Does Europe build all of this and have its own sovereign capability in every single area, and America has its own and China has its own? Unfortunately, I'm not sure. In a way, I don't see the world operating like that. And frankly, Europe hasn't got the dynamism or the capital to compete. And we've also missed the boat, I think, quite frankly. I think what it will probably mean is not having an over-reliance on one geography, on one partner, right? So it will mean having some reliance on some Chinese technology. It will mean having some reliance on US core technology and not having, but not being underwritten solely, for example, in the case of defense by effectively by one country. So yeah, I think it's a harder, more nuanced question when it comes to digital sovereignty than in other areas.
I love the context of setting it in being a power user, power buyer, power investor. I think that's one thing I've taken from this conversation today, is to think, not to use your unambitious rant against you, Lomax, but I think there is something about thinking in those three buckets, right?
No, you're totally right. But then if the NHS puts all of its data on a US cloud provider, like suddenly, you get a nefarious.
Isn't it already?
Well, yes, exactly. But do you see what I mean? Like that's not sovereignty. So what do? You spread it across, data set. In those cases, you build.
Hey, listen, you suck it up, Buttercup, and you think, okay, we're going to become power users. That opportunity maybe isn't there, or we're going to do that behind the scenes, and we're just going to absolutely apply the application to create the efficiencies that are at least going to give us some gains.
No, and you become a big customer. Don't forget, the EU bloc, including the UK, has incredible buying power, right? So you could lean into that, but it doesn't help you in times of war. It's the problem.
So guys, let me come in here for a thought, and I'm going to champion the European startup ecosystem as always. So pension funds, I think, are really important here, and we talk about how do we get to digital sovereignty. European pension funds allocate a pathetic 0.018% of their AUM to European venture. That's against 1.9% to the US. So we're funneling billions into American VCs and startups and scale up that only serve to further build the US dominance and US sovereignty. We really need that our pension funds start backing Europe and not US dominance. Because the way we're doing it now, yes, we might be getting returns back, but honestly, European venture performs beautifully. We've got 18.95% net IRR over 10 years as per Invest Europe. So you're not necessarily sacrificing gains by investing here as a European pension fund. You're just backing our society's future strength. I really think this is so important. I think it's like US pension funds fuel 50% of their VCs, and we're basically propping up our own rivals. It's really time that we reorient our pension funds around the European venture and startup market. I think it's so important. And it's ridiculous to see this continuing going on when we have, this complete breakup between the US and Europe, and then we continue having our pension funds.
But when they say, Andreas, when they say, give us the winners first, you give us the winners, we'll invest. When they say that?
Yeah, something like that.
Mads, anything else on this topic before we close off?
So much more to unpack here, Dan. I mean, Lomax, you picked up on the point of globalization and how that's been an issue. And I think that's something we often talk about, but I actually think it's a little more nuanced than that. I think to some extent, we've had these, I call them luxury beliefs here in Europe that said that, look, we don't like pollution, we don't like climate change, we don't like all the bad stuff. So we'll just we'll legislate against it. And the implication is then that, energy prices in Europe, they go up 4 times or 6 times compared to Chinese competition. The manufacturing moves out to China. The manufacturing moves out to India. We've looked at things like some of the ingredients in pharmaceuticals. We have to import so many of those today because we can't manufacture them or won't manufacture them in Europe anymore because it's too expensive and there's too much regulation that prevents it. The pollution hasn't gone away. We've just transported it somewhere else in the world. And then, I think one can do that. One can say, listen, I don't want to pollute my backyard. I want to pollute kind of China's backyard instead. But if we then don't put some trade mechanisms in place, that just completely undercuts our own manufacturing base. And I think that's what's happened. So I don't think it's just globalization by itself. It's also that we were quite naive in how we implemented it. And if there is one takeaway, I'd say, from Trump's rather kind of bizarre style, I think actually one thing he's right in is I think we were far too naive in how we kind of let China into the WTO in terms of how we have outsourced some of these things without asking for things in return. If we had been a little bit more shrewd around the implementation of globalization, I think we'd have had a better economic outcome, less dependency, and a stronger manufacturing base still in Europe. And that would have been, a much better outcome for us.
Yeah, but it's quite natural as economies develop that they move into services and away from manufacturing, right? That's I can't think of one economy that hasn't done that.
Well, I mean, the one who controls manufacturing dominates the world. The US won the Second World War on the base of an unrivaled manufacturing base. And if what we're saying is we want to give up manufacturing, then it's game over.
Well, we already have. We already have given up manufacturing. But
Germany still has a strong manufacturing base, and I wouldn't say it's game over for Europe yet. But if the implication of what you're saying is we should, then I'd say, well, then it is game over.
Well, no, I was just thinking it's actually quite timely that there's such levels of automation now that manufacturing isn't necessarily going to be Daisy and Johnny, building missiles or sewing sequins onto things or pressing car metal plates. It's so maybe there is this technological availability now where manufacturing onshore or managing your own supply and your own manufacturing plants is completely available because it's all automated. I mean,
I think it's beautiful thinking. The truth is that still today, on a per capita basis, China implements many, many more robots and much, much more automation in manufacturing than we do. Because the thing is, you have to have the manufacturing base to automate it. Now, the old system, the old setup in Europe was that you had the manufacturing base in the heartland of Europe, in Germany, and then you had the financial services and the services around that in London. And it was not two different economies. It was one ecosystem supporting each other, right? And obviously, any attempt to try and kind of fragmentize that or balkanize that and breaking it up, that just makes the system fall apart completely. Because the German industrial base does need a strong financial powerhouse to finance it, and the UK certainly needs, manufacturing. We can't just be services.
You were going to mention the B word then, weren't you? I could feel the B word just bubbling in your brain.
It's always there somewhere.
Gentlemen, what a pleasure and a gift. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us this week. Anything more from you or anything else on your mind this week that's bitten your backside?
No, I was just saying it was a true pleasure to join you guys. I'm so happy to be continually supporting you guys. So thank you.
You are awesome. Thank you so much. Mads, anything else that you've seen this week that you wanted to just chat about before we close off?
Well, we do have potentially big news, right? Google might be broken up.
Really?
I don't necessarily know if it'll go that bad, but we are expecting a kind of a verdict coming soon. And, will it be forced to spin off Chrome or something else? We don't know yet.
Don't you think, Matt, that it all now, based on the Intel story that we discussed earlier today, is going to come down to what agreement can be struck between Trump and the Google management?
You're probably right.
So exciting.
So we'll see the US government taking 10% of Google and with a little backhander for the Trump children somewhere, I'm sure.
Be nice if you can get it, right?
Allegedly. Gents, thank you so much. This has been Upside. We will catch you next week. Upside.